Well, hello and welcome to the Light Reading Podcast. I'm Jeff Baumgartner, a senior editor at Light Reading.
I'm Nicole Ferraro. I'm an editor covering Broadband at Light Reading and host of the Divide podcast.
And I'm Blair Levin, your guest.
Well, a very important guest at that. So we really, I think I can speak for Nicole in saying we're excited to have you on as our guest again on the podcast. I know you've joined Nicole a few times on the Divide, but your insights into the regulatory world and your ability to spell out the implications of what's going on is invaluable to us and our readers, and in terms of trying to make heads and tails of everything that's going on in Washington. So your notes are must read as they provide pretty incredibly helpful barometer on the regulatory landscape. And there's obviously a lot going on in the as the new administration digs in and tries to move ahead with its agenda. So today, I think we're going to try to cover some of that ground and talk about what's next for things like BEAD, universal service reform. We're going to touch a little bit on spectrum, the national broadband plan, and at the end, I think we'll talk about the remnants of network neutrality. Maybe not quite dead and buried, but maybe a few scoops of dirt on it, I guess, in the grave. But before we dive into all that, all those topics, Blair, let's start high level a little bit and get your thoughts about the level of regulatory activity and intrigue we've seen in recent weeks. I'm not one, I don't really follow this area as closely as you do. I'll swoop in when necessary. And Nicole does keep a close eye on a lot of things in the regulatory world. But from my perspective, it feels like we've really leveled up to this maybe an abnormal level of activity. I don't know if you would agree, Blair, but is this really par for the course when a new administration comes in, or is this like an amazing wave of activity right now?
So I think you have to distinguish between regulatory activity that actually has an impact in the real world, and I don't want to quite say the entertainment wing of the regulatory proceedings, but those things which have really limited impact and aren't really regulatory, but are designed to do something else. The current chair of the FCC is by far the most politically savvy chair in a while, and he's certainly in the last commission, he was politically very adept, uses the bully pulpit very well. But I don't think there's been a lot of regulatory activity. Okay. What has happened since the election? He wrote a letter to the tech companies asking for information about their relationship with NewsGuard. Won't go down that rabbit hole. I'm just saying, but that was just that was done as part of an effort to try to build up this narrative of the tech censorship cartel. But there's no government action behind it. He wrote a letter to Disney complaining about their negotiations with their local affiliate groups, but there's no regulatory activity behind it. There is certainly, they're going to have a meeting on the 27th. There's a few new things, but those are quite normal. And he has started some enforcement actions, particularly against broadcasters and particularly against public broadcasting, that may signal a certain kind of regulatory activity, but it is not the kind of regulatory activity where we say we're either going to adopt new rules or we're going to get rid of some rules. They are going to get rid of some rules. He's effectively gotten rid of the proceeding on bulk billing and stuff like that. But I wouldn't say there's a lot of regulatory activity. I would say there's a lot of bully pulpit use, a very effective use of the bully pulpit, and a lot of intrigue. And that is always true at the beginning of an administration, particularly when there are new people to get into their positions.
So more intrigue than action, maybe, at this point?
Yeah, but I think that's also quite normal. I do think Carr will be a very consequential chair. The FCC will be consequential in this year. But as of now, the most important things are going to do. Those haven't been fully articulated. Those aren't on the February agenda or anything like that.
Okay. Well, then we're definitely going to talk a little bit more about the Carr FCC, but we're going to get into that. But maybe, Nicole, you've been keeping very close tabs on what's going on with the BEAD program and thinking about what's going to happen next. So I'll let you take that part.
Yeah, sure. And just to spell out what BEAD is, it's, of course, the $42.5 billion broadband equity access and deployment program that was passed in the infrastructure law in 2021. And basically since then has been taking shape. And at the end of the Biden administration, we were just starting to see some states get approvals on their final plans and start to name some providers who were going to win those BEAD awards. And now we're in sort of shrug emoji territory in terms of what's going to happen next. So, Blair, you've put out a fair amount of notes on BEAD speculation based on the tea leaves in the regulatory atmosphere. So there's been some speculation around what might happen given Elon Musk's role in the federal government and the fact that he owns Starlink and was not very happy when Starlink got kicked out of the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund. Also, Republicans in general want fewer rules attached to the BEAD program, including maybe removing the fiber preference and affordable service requirements, among other things. So first of all, what changes do you currently see coming for BEAD? And moreover, do you believe that BEAD is going to move forward in one form or another?
Well, let me just start by making a point that is kind of interesting to me, but maybe not that interesting to everyone else, which is simply, let's step away from talking about BEAD as BEAD, but rather, will Trump kill Biden's largest DEI program? Okay. Because Trump is very anti-DEI, as is the whole Republican Party. Well, the largest DEI program actually is BEAD. I know people don't think of it that way, but if you actually look at the legislation and the findings behind it, it's all about equity and inclusion for rural America. And, like the woman who said, get the government's hands off my Medicare, rural America does not like to believe that they are the beneficiary of a DEI program, but they're the beneficiary of a lot of DEI programs. There's a lot in the Department of Agriculture. There's a lot in rural utility services. Those are DEI programs. And I am for that. Wearing my Brookings hat, wearing my policy hat, I have no problem with that. But I think we should acknowledge what it really is. Now, as to what happens, look, the NTIA had a number of requirements. I don't think those were actually binding, including the fiber preference. I don't think that was meaningful in terms of actual capital allocation decisions, which is what I and the clients I serve when I write my notes care about. There is no doubt that the new NTIA administrator will do a number of things to remove the so-called requirements on labor, on climate, on blah, 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 many, many different things. One of them that's interesting is they're going to get rid of the affordability rules, which they regard as rate regulation. I will just point out that the FCC, ever since it started funding what are effectively monopolies in high-cost areas, has had some limit on what can be charged. Including under Republicans, right? But now we're calling it rate regulation. That's not that material to the capital allocation decisions. What is relevant, I think, is the extent to which there is a federally mandated high-cost threshold that says to the states, yes, you have a budget of X, but you can't spend more than Y on any individual location. And if the number is low enough, what you will do is you will switch the governor's preferences, because it's the governors who prefer fiber. They will be forced to spend less on fiber and more on satellite or fixed wireless. That, to me, is kind of the only really interesting issue. Everything else, I think, is pretty predictable and not that meaningful in terms of the large cap companies who the investors are interested in. In other words, you're fundamentally deciding whether you're giving money to AT&T, Charter, and some others, or you're giving money to satellite. And that one decision is kind of the core to that. Everything else, to me, is very incrementally relevant. But I don't think BEAD is going away. And this goes back to my point, which is even though it is a DEI program, and the White House has said we're getting rid of all DEI programs, they're not getting rid of this one. I think what you saw in the follow-up questions to soon-to-be Secretary Ludnick, you have the Republican senators from Alaska and West Virginia saying, my state's been really working hard to come up with a plan. Don't pause the program and don't change things that causes all that work to go down the drain. I think that's the view of a lot of Republicans. We'll see whether there's a conflict with Elon Musk on that, who obviously would love it if we just spent all the money on satellite and returned money to Treasury. But I don't think that's what's going to happen.
Okay, and a quick follow-up to that then. In terms of the companies that you're watching and you're providing analysis for, are they still on track in terms of their BEAD plans, or is this sort of creating confusion for both companies that have already been technically awarded funding from Louisiana and the couple of other states that awarded funding, and for the companies that are trying to make their BEAD plan?
It's a little bit difficult to know because just like with spectrum auctions, companies say certain things like, oh my God, if you have the territories defined in this way or the markets defined in this way, we're just not participating. And then, of course, they show up for the auction. That is a traditional way of essentially working the refs. So What they say ahead of time, you have to take with a little bit of grain of salt. You don't really know what they're going to do until you actually have the grant process or something like a reverse auction in play. I think all the companies that are involved are trying to get the states to do the most favorable process for them. And I think that's when we find out whether they're really going to be involved. But they've been working all along with the states, and I suspect there'll be high levels of involvement in some areas. It is a very tricky thing, and I think this is one of the things that's not well understood in D.C. about the BEAD program is if you say, as the Capital Projects Program, which was in Treasury, does, we're going to give you money, all you need to do is make progress, that's relatively easy. But if you say, we're going to give you money and you must finish the job and close the digital divide, the access divide, that's much, much harder because there are always going to be areas where really nobody wants to serve because it's not economic, and they'll end up being in satellite.
Yeah. I from my side, I'm trying to keep an eye on what the cable folks are going to be doing with BEAD, and with an example being Charter, very aggressive with RDOF.
Yes,
and they've been pretty upfront that they're not exactly jazzed about BEAD because of some of the restrictions. I just wonder with some of the maybe additional levels of uncertainty how that's going to affect a company like Charter. But I guess that's kind of a wait and see. So
well, you said wait and see. My guess is they have anticipated since the election that all the requirements they don't like will go away.
Okay, so it might be
they've changed their strategy. And I think that's right.
Well, good. Now, Nicole, that is one last thing on satellite related to BEAD. Obviously, we know that or want to get maybe your view on the role of Starlink and how maybe that will evolve. Obviously, Elon Musk would love to have Starlink pretty heavily involved. But we did see, you mentioned like Alaska, that there's some areas there where there's still coverage lacking from Starlink. But I think from a high level, is this going to be? Do you think this is going to be really good for Starlink? And what about other satellite broadband service providers? Should they be celebrating at this point, or is it still a little too early to know?
Well, look, I think it's a mixed bag. Satellite's core addressable market is low density, by which I mean rural America. The federal government is now saying we're going to pour $42 billion into those markets. From the perspective of the satellite companies, the government is overbuilding, right? It is investing in money to compete with where their most prominent addressable market is. So it's both an opportunity and a danger, because every fiber network that is deployed, and again, the governors want to deploy as many fiber networks as possible or connect as many to fiber as possible. That takes a customer away from satellite. Satellite has huge fixed costs in the sky. I think it's notable that their monthly service charge is much higher than the terrestrial folks because the operating costs are, I mean, there's lots of difference, but it has to do with operating costs. So I think it's a very much of a mixed bag. They would rather the money go to them. Who wouldn't? But we'll see what happens. Louisiana had some money for satellite, but not as much as I'm sure satellite would have liked.
Okay.
All right. Well, turning over to the Universal Service Fund, another topic that's clear in terms of what's coming ahead, and no confusing questions at all surrounding this. So the Universal Service Fund funds lots of high cost and programs, as well as the Lifeline program. And as we know, it's been in need of reform for some time. Congress has been working on it. But in that time period, the USF also faced court challenges and was deemed unconstitutional last year by the Fifth Circuit Court, and now awaits its fate with the Supreme Court. I believe that's coming in June, is our understanding, right?
The oral argument will be, I believe, March 26th.
Okay.
The decision will be provided in, it will not be any earlier than June. It will be June. Okay. I think last year they went to July, whatever. Yes.
Sure. Okay. So then in terms of all of that, first of all, what are your thoughts on what may happen with the Supreme Court? And second of all, do you think it makes sense for Congress to move forward with any reforms before the court issues its ruling, or wait until after the Supreme Court rules?
So as to the first question, what do I think the court will do? I think the court will uphold the universal service framework. I would note the Sixth Circuit and the 11th Circuit, also notably conservative circuits, have upheld it. Like many issues, I can predict three votes to uphold the Fifth Circuit, 3 votes to overturn it, and the 3 votes in the middle, what it was now the middle of this court. I think they end up being on the side of industry to maintain the current structure. But I could be wrong. I mean, we'll ask me again on the 27th of March.
Sure. Yeah.
But you can guess who the 3 judges I'll be watching the most. Congress should not do anything until they have that rule, because if they rule that the FCC cannot raise the money itself, then Congress has to do something different. As to what Congress should do, I think the relevant here's the situation, and I haven't seen people other than me saying this, but I have a high level of confidence about this. Sometime before Congress starts to really do universal service reform, Trump and Musk are going to declare victory. They're going to get up on the metaphoric battleship and have a big mission accomplished banner behind them, saying that we were able to do in a few months what Joe Biden couldn't do in 4 years. And we're connecting all of rural America. Now, they won't actually do that and blah, blah, blah. But my point is, how does that then affect the debate about universal service? Traditional universal service, about an $8 to $9 billion fund, more than half of it goes to the high cost areas, rural America. And then you have E-rate, and then you have, which goes to institutions, schools, libraries, healthcare facilities. And then you have low income. But if you say we don't need to do any high costs anymore, which, by the way, enormously problematic for rural telephone companies. But if Trump wants to declare victory, and my guess is he does, and Musk wants to say we use Doge to be more efficient in how we did this, which I think he does. And remember, Trump went on Rogan and said, they want to spend $1 trillion in upstate. I thought it was hilarious that Donald Trump thinks all rural areas are upstate. It's only in New York that it's upstate, but that's what he said.
There's
and then he
one
also
rural
said,
area.
Elon can provide the service. It's better, and he can do it for nothing. Okay, Elon doesn't charge nothing. But my point is, it's not what's true that matters. It's what does Trump believe that matters. I think Trump
blanket statement. Yeah.
He'll just say, we solved the problem. It's like we built the wall. I don't know. Yeah. Anyway, how does that then affect the debate? There's a lot of support for E-rate and a lot of support for low income, but is it sufficient? Will they say, as to E-rate, that's really a state problem. Let the states decide how to support schools, libraries, and healthcare facilities.
Right.
I'm not predicting that. I'm just saying that's a scenario. And so you could get to a point where universal service, which we have done in a variety of ways since the 1934 Act, and indeed actually, in a way, the settlement of the first antitrust case with AT&T back in, I believe, 1913 created a universal service framework for making sure everyone was connected and it was affordable to all. We may be abandoning that. I don't know.
Right. So then the other program, not a high cost program that USF funds is Lifeline, which is the $9.25 subsidy for telecom services, which is not nearly enough for low income households in terms of covering their broadband plans. And so there had been hope in the prior era that the now dead Affordable Connectivity Program would combine with Lifeline under a reformed universal service fund and become a larger subsidy for low-income households. Is that anywhere in the future anymore at this point? I mean, you're describing a USF that might just go away.
It might, but I do think that it's also possible that it continues and that E-rate and low-income continue. And if that happens, Lifeline will become an AC. There'll be some hybrid. There'll be a mixture of that. I think we have to evaluate whether we want to support both mobile and fixed. Wearing my policy hat, I would, but reasonable minds can differ. But part of the reason for my, if you want to call it this, optimism about that happening is that what's going to happen is, and it's already happening, a number of states are looking at adopting the New York model. The New York model mandates that large ISPs must offer a specified speed at a specified price to a specified group of low-income people. The companies will hate that, and they will fight it, but they've already lost the most significant legal challenges. They've said the FCC preempts it. I wouldn't be surprised if Brendan Carr says, wait a minute, the states can't do that because we've preempted it. The problem for him is the same problem that Ajit Pai had, which is if you say the FCC has no jurisdiction over broadband other than to preempt states from regulating broadband, it's not a very coherent legal argument to most courts, right? You're either in the game or you're out of the game. But if you're out of the game, you can't tell anybody else not to play, right? But the New York for the companies, not because of the specifics. I don't think Verizon economics is affected by complying with New York because they already have a program that's the same level or better. It is because if you give the states that power, that does put a cloud over all the companies in terms of Wall Street, because you never know what an individual state will do.
Right. Yes, and you've been saying as much and using this point as a reason that Congress should pass the ACP funding last year and the year before. And
I'm not a lobbyist. I'm saying that.
Yes. No, you're making an astute observation about what may come. And
one of the things. Look, I'm a Democrat. I served in the Clinton and Obama administrations. My politics are not exactly a mystery. But one of the things that distinguishes me in the way I think about the world from my progressive friends, who I deeply respect, is that I always tend to think in terms of incentives. And the incentives of the companies to use their political capital to lobby for an extension of ACP and really piss off Mike Johnson and a lot of Republicans was not really great. I think they were supportive of the extension, but they weren't going to throw a lot of political capital behind it. If, however, you have a number of states doing this, I think their attitude is very different. And I think it changes the incentive structure for federal action.
Okay. Good stuff. Well, I thought maybe we transition a little bit to the new FCC. We talked a little bit about it up top with Brendan Carr. So we've got the new chairman. He's going to lead what will be Republican majority at the commission and push ahead with likely policies and actions that Trump wants. So what is your reaction to the Brendan Carr FCC so far? You mentioned the bully pulpit part of it, but is this about as expected so far? Any surprises early on?
I don't think so. Look, I don't mean to go down a rabbit hole of long history, but I'm going to do a little bit of history pretty quick.
Okay.
I joined the FCC in '93. At that point in time, there was a bipartisan consensus about we need to have competition drive communications market. My boss and Al Gore understood the power of digital networks, that you take a single purpose analog cable network, you take a single purpose being video, a single purpose voice network, which the telcos had, and you now digitize them and you create competition in wireless, and you do things like lower the wireless interconnection to wired, and you do a bunch of things that enable a lot of competition between all the networks. And that played out. And I would say the Republicans agreed with that strategy. On a tactical level, Michael Powell did things differently than Hunt and Kennard, but was driving toward the same end. We get to 2009, we realize, of course, everything is now about broadband, except for the policies. So we have the National Broadband Plan, we adjust, we do a bunch of things to create what is fundamentally a broadband policy regime. And that's bipartisan too. And I would say, even though I would have disagreed with how Ajit Pai did certain things, he always, what he was reflecting essentially were the goals of the National Broadband Plan, which is get networks everywhere, get everybody on them, utilize them better. Carr's priorities are outside of that. What I would say is economic, policy should, at its heart, be about driving higher standards of living, economic growth, and social progress. Carr has a very political agenda. I don't think that's just analysis. Look at where he has spent his time. He has held up the CBS deal, as far as I can tell, solely for political reasons. He has instigated various enforcement actions, brought back enforcement actions against NBC and ABC, but not Fox, solely for political reasons. Here's a very interesting thing. He just wrote a letter to a PBS affiliate in San Francisco pointing out that they had covered an ICE raid of immigrants and asking, how is that serving the public interest? My question to Brendan is, what is your definition of the public interest? You keep saying broadcasters have to adhere to it, but you have not identified what it is. Would you kindly tell us what you think it is? Because I'm frankly quite confused about what you think the public interest is. Now, Brendan will...
doesn't upset him.
Yeah. Now, we'll see what happens with these enforcement actions.
Yeah.
Brendan's people have said, we're going to do a proceeding on the public interest standard. I don't think they ever will, because to do so, I think, would make it transparent and also make it difficult for companies that he likes, like Sinclair and Salem Broadcast. So having said that, Brendan will be very significant because he's going to reform the media ownership rules, which I would agree it's well past time. The market has shifted dramatically. That will be significant, and that will have collateral impact on the cable guys and on other ISPs and stuff like that. It's interesting that he started with a proceeding on the C-band, which I think is, very, very legitimate place to have a notice of inquiry. It appears that what he wants to do is take some of the C-band currently controlled by SES and Intelsat, who are merging, and auction it. But I'm not sure, because Elon Musk wrote a letter saying, don't do that, just allow greater sharing among satellite providers. Well,
yeah,
I don't think that's what happens, but it's an interesting point.
Well, it sets up a battle, right? Or it's going to. I mean, there's a lot of politicking around the C-band right now, and I think the cable folks are going to be very concerned because it ties into their wireless strategy now, because they're not big buyers of spectrum, but they've been using.
Yeah, there's a lot, and it is true that during the Biden administration, there was no big swatch of spectrum that went into the commercial sector. Carr has blamed the Biden administration for that. I would point out that, with the exception of the C-band auction, everything that Ajit Pai auctioned was set up during the Wheeler time, or even some of it was started with Janikowski. But he did not essentially seed the field for things for Jessica to do. But, let's not go down the rabbit hole of history. There is a big backlog. There'll be the AWS-3 auction. There is a debate about the lower 3 gigahertz, which is currently controlled by the military, that is now part of the discussions vis-a-vis the reconciliation bill. There's the C-band. There's a big question mark about whether Dish may sell some of its spectrum portfolio. So there are a lot of different issues related to spectrum that will be resolved within the next few years. And again, Carr will be very consequential in that way, but he is going to have to deal with competing interests. Like you said, the cable guys have their view of what should happen. The telcos or the wireless guys have their view. Musk has his view. There's AT&T's petition to change the CBRS rules. So lots of stuff.
Well, I think I already know who the big winner is in what's going on with spectrum. It'll be Mike Dano.
I was going to say,
because he's with us here at Light Reading, and he's all over the spectrum thing, and he just loves that. And I think the more intrigue and the more battles that happen, the happier Mike is. So, like you said, he's the big winner. Yeah.
I'm not Mike's psychiatrist. I'm just going to predict he's going to be happier in the next 2 to 3 years than he was in the last 4 years. Where
we'll check back with him.
There wasn't that much happening in spectrum. Can I just point out one thing that I totally loved, which was Jessica as chair. I think she did not issue the licenses to T-Mobile for an auction that they had won, the 2.5, where they'd been the primary winner. And I think what she was thinking was, if I don't issue the licenses, T-Mobile will fight for auction authority, and I need to get my auction authority back. Instead, what T-Mobile did was it went to Congress and said, just pass a law giving her permission to give us the licenses. We've already paid for them. And you guys want more use, and we want to use them, which is what Congress did. The day the Senate passed it, she put out for public notice a 2-year-old petition by AT&T to have a spectrum screen starting at 2.5 going up to 6. Why did she wait 2 years and then do it the day the Senate passed? I've always thought it's her way. The AT&T petition is clearly designed to limit T-Mobile. I just thought it was her way of saying, oh, well, you beat me over in Congress, but I made you. But she never did anything with it, and I don't think she will. I don't think Carr will either. But it was kind of this move that really was meaningless, or it appeared to be meaningless. But in the little world of spectrum, Mike Dano, I'm sure, wrote about it.
Oh yeah, no, he was on that one. Well, the one thing, just to stick with things that Carr's been focused on. You had mentioned, you brought up CBS, right? And
yeah.
So I guess, and you addressed this in one of your recent research notes, but I was wondering if you can talk a little bit about how concerned the broadcasters, maybe other than Fox, maybe should be with respect to the notion or the idea of getting their licenses pulled, revoked over editorial coverage, and particularly when, again, with all the heat that's being put on CBS and the directives or the letters to like Disney.
Yeah. So Trump has said that they should get their licenses. CBS should have its license revoked. Biggest scandal in broadcast history. My view of history is a little bit different than that, but okay. I think the odds of Carr actually revoking any CBS licenses are very low. Can Trump call him up and say, I told you to revoke the licenses. If you don't do it in the next 30 days, you're fired? That's possible. I don't know how Brendan would react to that. But there is no legal precedent for revoking licenses. And if they did it, it would be a very long proceeding that would eventually go to the courts. And there's no way, in my opinion, that even the most conservative court would uphold the revocation of a license. But Brendan has huge leverage because he is reviewing a transaction, and he is not bound by any clock to do the transaction within a certain set time, nor is he actually bound in terms of court review to justify to a court why he didn't approve the transaction. And the reason is because of what Jessica did on the Tegna transaction. They had a document which said, we're sending this to the administrative law judge for these reasons. But when that was challenged in court, the court said, since you're taking it to an ALJ, you're in the middle of the proceeding. We don't have jurisdiction until there's a final decision from the FCC. And of course, that would have been 2 years later. And the people wanting to buy Tegna could not wait around. End of the deal. So Brendan can effectively kill the deal. He has the leverage to do that. And that's where his leverage really is with CBS rather than revocation. The challenge for others is that if you know that the media ownership rules are going to be changed, you know that you want to either be a buyer or a seller. Because once those change, everyone's either buying or selling. But you want whatever your deal is to get through as quickly as possible. And if you're on the political outs, that ain't going to happen. So that's the problem in the broadcast world. But I don't think it should be people worrying about license revocations, no matter what Trump says. And I think Carr's a very smart guy, and he recognizes that if he were to essentially say, yeah, revocation is really an option, and I'm going to revoke people's licenses, the entire broadcast, the market value of broadcast licenses will go down because they're, instead of being, an 8-year property right with an expectation of renewal, they are simply a right at the discretion of the king. And those aren't very valuable.
Yeah, it's hard to think about the kind of chaos that would cause, if they tried to move forward with something like that, just in general. Interesting.
Well, we have chaos in a variety of other places right now,
There's plenty of that.
NIH and Department of Education and lots of other. I mean, I live in a DC neighborhood that has a lot of people who are involved in foreign aid. There's a tremendous amount of chaos. So that's not the gating factor here. The gating factor is the destruction of value in the capital markets.
Good. Well, Nicole? Yeah, I figured we could jump ahead to. You want to talk about the National Broadband Plan? And
yeah, sure. You mentioned the Ridge a little while ago, Blair. But Senator Wicker recently put out a bill calling for a proposal on a bill calling for a new national broadband plan. And as
we call it a strategy, not a plan. So
indeed, thank you for the clarification there. And as the main guy who worked on the last one, the original one in 2009, right, 2010-ish. What are your thoughts? Do we need a new national broadband plan? Did you read the bill? What do you think? And what should a new national broadband plan look like? Knowing that this conversation could be its own podcast at a high level. What are your thoughts?
Yeah. So number one, yes, there should be a new one. Number two, I read the bill. I agree with a lot of it. The one very important thing I agree with, I think he is right to put it at NTIA rather than at the FCC. A lot of different reasons for that. In retrospect, and I'm responsible in some ways. I wish the last one had been an NTIA, not the FCC. But I think that I would, there are certain tweaks. The tweaks actually aren't that important. What's important is what does the leadership of the effort think? I would be a little more focused on utilization. I would be focused on efficiencies in government utilizing broadband. I would be a little bit more focused on artificial intelligence. But those are really minor. I think it's great. I hope it passes. I hope somebody does it. If they want my advice, I'm always happy to give it to them. But the key thing is that you actually kind of need every 10 years. I would actually argue every 5 years. You need a comprehensive look. The most significant things that happened out of the National Broadband Plan, one of the funny things to me is people would come to me at the beginning and say, what are you going to do? I said, I'm going to ask a lot of questions. We'll read the answers and then we'll figure it out. And they said, yeah, Blair, I know. You have to say that. What are you really going to do? I said, ask a lot of questions. And no one believed me. But if you look at what actually happened, whether it be Google Fiber and Comcast Internet Essentials, which kind of grew out of discussions we had, or the incentive auctions, or FirstNet, or those were not top of my mind at the beginning. They came out of the discussions. So I'm very much like, if you ask the right questions, you will get better answers. And there's no one in the government asking the right questions at this moment in time. Wicker's effort could lead to that, so I'm totally for it.
Awesome.
All right. Well,
back to you, Jeff.
Yeah, I thought we'd wrap up with network neutrality, right? The thing that we've been writing about for decades, and like we said up front, all but dead, from at the federal level. But but there's still some state related activity. So I think the question I had is: do you expect to see more states take the lead on network neutrality and mimic what we've seen in California with net neutrality? We talked about New York with the Affordable Broadband Act. And if so, is this sort of what would that sort of fragmentation mean for the operators in those states? We talked about there's plenty of chaos to go around already. It feels like that would just add to the chaos.
I'm not sure. First of all, I think states are likely to be more focused on low income than on net neutrality at this point in time. Right. Secondly, I see no difference in the way the companies operate in California, where they're subject to a net neutrality regime, and where they operate in the other states where they're not. It doesn't affect the economics. It doesn't affect investment. It doesn't affect strategy. It's just not. I have been of the view since really about 10 years ago that the incentives have changed. And whereas in the past you might have worried about it, you don't really think you need to worry about it. And the demonstration of that is that AT&T sold off Time Warner Entertainment. The argument about net neutrality was in some sense always about, are you going to use your network to favor a certain kind of content? And what AT&T discovered, but what I think lots of other people knew, is there's no synergy in discriminating in favor of your content. It doesn't really work in the real world. And I think that's absolutely the case. But having said that, I don't know how long we exist in the world where the FCC has essentially no jurisdiction over broadband. You're going to have a series of issues, cybersecurity, resiliency of networks, and others, where it's a little bit tricky. Can the FCC actually do anything? By the way, you also have the problem with, can they enforce anything? That's a separate issue. But, eventually, big networks that have a huge amount to do with public services and are very important for the country, there is some level of regulation. I think we get back to that eventually, but not in the context of the non-discrimination, but in the context of other things where the government has certain needs. I mean, but the net neutrality fight has really not been relevant to Wall Street for a number of years, even though both sides say it is.
Yeah.
It's just not.
Yeah. And the whole focus of the discussion has changed. You're right, because if we're talking about an ISP that's going to try to block or prioritize or throttle unfairly, it's like in this competitive environment, it's like cutting your own throat anyway. So,
it's a competitive environment. Yeah. You could argue that in 2005, when Ed Whittaker, I think it was 2005, when Ed Whittaker made his comment about if Yahoo and Google think they're going to ride on my network for free, I believe what he actually said was that's bullshit. But I think it was cleaned up by the AT&T communications department. You could argue that there were incentives for him to do that.
Yeah.
And it would have been reminiscent of how the cable physical networks discriminated in terms of the content. They said, we will carry your content, and this is in the 80s, but you have to give us a percentage of your company. And so John Malone ended up owning lots of different cable channels.
It's like applying that model.
Well, that is what that is what the local exchange carriers wanted to do. In the early days of the dial-up internet, we wouldn't let them, and that's why you had AOL and others arise. Then that issue came back with cable open access and some other things. But the point is, in a world where the average download speed was 5 megabits per second download, there were incentives to discriminate. In a world where the average download speed is 250, I don't think you can make money discriminating. I could be wrong about that, but it's pretty dubious to me. So it's not only that there's competition, but that the speeds are fast enough that you take away the incentives.
Okay. Well, I, for one, am glad that it's kind of a non-issue now. We can put it to bed for a while, hopefully. But
tired of writing the same story.
Yeah.
Jessica, I believe that was the 7th iteration of net neutrality. So
I'm glad you're keeping tabs, because I'm like, it's a lot. I don't know what number we're on, but great. Well, I think that's where we're going to wrap it up. We covered a lot of ground, but Blair, thanks so much for your time and insight and helping us get a better understanding of regulatory issues. Pardon?
Happy to do it. Good to see you both.
Yeah, you too. We got to figure out these regulatory issues that are impacting the telecom industry. And Nicole, thanks for joining and providing your valuable perspective as well.
And thank you, Jeff, as well.
You're all
thank you,
so
everyone.
well. All right. Have a great one. All right.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.